The morning sky over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, stretched endlessly blue, broken only by scattered clouds that offered little concealment. Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu tightened his grip on the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M0, scanning the horizon with eyes trained through 2 years of combat. He had survived Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Philippines, and the grinding attrition of the Solomons. He knew what American fighters could do, or so he believed. The Wildcat had been manageable, predictable in its patterns, but the radio chatter filling his headset that morning carried a different tone, an edge of panic he had not heard before from his fellow pilots. They were reporting a new American fighter, and the descriptions made no sense. It was fast, they said. Too fast. It could climb with a zero, dive faster, and it would not burn when hit. More troubling still, there seemed to be hundreds of them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Tanimizu had been briefed about the new American fighters entering service, but the intelligence reports painted them as mere incremental improvements, heavier, perhaps, but still bound by the same limitations that had made the Zero the master of Pacific skies. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, they were told, was just another product of American mass production, quantity over quality, a flying tank that sacrificed the elegance and agility that defined Japanese naval aviation. This assessment would prove to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in the history of aerial warfare. The Hellcat was not simply an improved Wildcat. It was a complete reimagining of carrier-based fighter design, built from the ground up with a single purpose: to kill Zeros and the men who flew them. The story of why Japanese pilots came to fear the Hellcat above all other Allied fighters is not merely a tale of technical specifications or kill ratios, though those numbers are staggering enough. It is a story of psychological transformation, of the systematic dismantling of confidence built over years of victories. It is about the moment when Japan's finest naval aviators realized that the war they thought they were fighting had fundamentally changed, and that the skills that had made them elite were no longer sufficient for survival. The Hellcat represented something more terrifying than superior technology. It embodied the collision between Japanese assumptions about American industrial capability and the brutal reality of what that capability could produce when fully mobilized. To understand the depth of this transformation, one must first understand what the Zero had meant to Japanese naval aviation and to the men who flew it. When the Mitsubishi A6M entered service in 1940, it was arguably the finest carrier-based fighter in the world. Its performance, characteristics seemed almost impossible for its time. With a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour and a range exceeding 1,500 miles with external tanks, it could fly farther and faster than any carrier fighter in existence. Its climb rate was exceptional, its turning radius legendary. American intelligence officers who first encountered detailed reports of the Zero's capabilities literally did not believe them, assuming the data represented multiple different aircraft, or that Japanese claims were simple propaganda. But the Zero's true advantage in the early war years was not purely technical. It was the product of a specific philosophy of aerial combat that had been refined through years of fighting in China and formalized in the Japanese Navy's rigorous training programs. Japanese naval aviators received extensive instruction before reaching fleet squadrons, often more than 700 hours of flight time, compared to the 200 or fewer hours, typical for early American naval aviators. They were taught that victory belonged to the pilot who could outmaneuver his opponent, who could achieve the perfect firing position through superior handling of his aircraft. The Zero was designed to enable this philosophy. Every unnecessary pound had been stripped away. There was no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant systems. The aircraft was built for performance, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, that performance was devastating. Lieutenant Tanimizu embodied this tradition. He had entered flight training in 1941, part of the generation that would carry Japan's aerial offensive across the Pacific. His instructors had been veterans of China, men who spoke reverently of the art of aerial combat, of the almost spiritual connection between pilot and machine, when both were pushed to their absolute limits. He had learned to exploit every degree of the Zero's turning ability, to recognize the precise moment when an opponent made a mistake that could be converted into a killing shot. By the time he reached his carrier assignment aboard the WWII in early 1943, he had internalized the fundamental assumption that defined Japanese naval aviation, that superior skill and superior aircraft handling would always triumph over brute force. This assumption was not baseless. For nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, it had been validated in combat after combat. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese fighters had shot down 66 American aircraft while losing only 43 of their own. In the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal, though Japan ultimately lost the campaign, individual Japanese pilots consistently achieved favorable kill ratios. The American Grumman F6F Wildcat, while rugged and well-armed, was outclassed in nearly every performance category. American pilots learned to survive through defensive tactics, the thatch, weave and similar maneuvers that used teamwork to compensate for individual aircraft limitations, but these were acknowledged as defensive measures, adaptations to fighting with an inferior machine. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp in 1943 and early 1944 was the scale and sophistication of the American response to these early defeats. The United States Navy had not simply accepted the Wildcat's limitations as permanent features of carrier aviation. Instead, they had done something that Japanese war planners had consistently underestimated. They had learned, adapted, and industrialized that learning at a pace Japan could not match. The Hellcat program had begun before Pearl Harbor, but it accelerated dramatically after the first encounters with Zeros revealed the true performance gap. Grumman engineers had access to something invaluable, a captured, intact Zero that had crash-landed in the Aleutians in June 1942. They could study its construction, test its performance, identify its weaknesses. The F6F Hellcat that emerged from this process in mid-1943 was purpose-built to defeat the Zero in the specific conditions of Pacific carrier warfare. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2 double wasp engine generated 2,000 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 380 miles per hour, nearly 50 miles per hour faster than the Zero. More critically, it could dive at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour without structural failure, while the Zero's lighter construction began to experience control problems above 350 miles per hour. The Hellcat could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding the Zero's climb rate while carrying far more ammunition and fuel. It mounted 6 50-caliber machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, compared to the Zero's 2 20mm cannons with just 60 rounds each and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns. But raw performance numbers tell only part of the story. What made the Hellcat truly lethal was how these specifications translated into tactical advantages that systematically negated everything Japanese pilots had trained to exploit. The aircraft's exceptional dive performance meant American pilots could choose when to engage and when to disengage. They could not be forced into the turning fights where the Zero excelled. The heavy armament meant that even brief firing opportunities could be lethal. American pilots did not need the perfect shot that Japanese training emphasized. A 1-second burst from 6 50-caliber guns could deliver devastating damage. The self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection meant that Hellcats could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero and still return to their carriers. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was the sheer number of Hellcats that began appearing over Pacific battlefields in mid-1944. Grumman's factory in Bethpage, New York, had been designed for mass production from the beginning. By June 1944, the facility was producing more than 500 Hellcats per month. The United States Navy would ultimately receive over 12,000 F6F fighters, compared to total Zero production of approximately 10,000 aircraft across all variants throughout the entire war. Japan's industrial capacity could not match this output, and even if it could, Japan's training programs could not produce pilots at anywhere near the rate required to match American losses, let alone American production. This was the context that Lieutenant Tanemizu and his fellow pilots entered as they climbed to meet the American strike aircraft approaching the Japanese carrier fleet that morning in June 1944. The battle that would unfold, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, would destroy any remaining illusions about the balance of air power in the cold Pacific. But for Tanemizu, climbing through 15,000 feet with his throttle fully forward, the full horror of what awaited had not yet crystallized. He still believed in his training, his aircraft, and the fundamental assumption that individual skill could overcome numerical disadvantage. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption had become. The radar operators aboard the American carriers had detected the Japanese strike waves while they were still over 100 miles away, giving the Americans time to launch their own fighters and vector them toward the incoming threat. This was another advantage. Japanese pilots had not fully appreciated American radar technology, and fighter direction had evolved far beyond what Japan had deployed. When Tanemizu's formation finally made visual contact with the enemy, what they saw must have seemed impossible. The sky ahead was filled with American fighters, not scattered flights of 4 or 6, but coordinated. Formations of dozens of aircraft, all positioned advantageously above the Japanese formations. The Hellcats dove. Modern air combat analysis often focuses on the technical specifications, the comparative speed and armament, but these numbers cannot fully capture what it meant to be a Japanese pilot facing a Hellcat dive attack for the first time. The American fighters came down at speeds the Zero could not match, could not even attempt to match, without risking structural failure. Japanese pilots who tried to dive away found the Hellcats simply followed, closing the distance, their heavier airframes actually accelerating faster in the dive. Those who attempted to turn and fight found that while the Zero could still outturn the Hellcat in level flight, the American pilots refused to engage in level-turning fights. They made slashing attacks, diving through formations, firing brief bursts that frequently proved lethal, then using their speed to climb back to altitude before the Zeros could respond. Lieutenant Tanemizu survived his first encounter with Hellcats through a combination of skill and luck. He had seen 3 aircraft from his formation destroyed in the first 2 minutes of combat, simply swatted from the sky by American fighters that seemed to be everywhere at once. He had attempted to maneuver for a firing solution on one Hellcat, only to have another appear from above, forcing him into a desperate diving turn that overstressed his airframe and sent him into a spin. He recovered at low altitude, his controls sluggish, his radio filled with the sounds of dying men. When he finally limped back to his carrier, he found it under attack, its deck fouled with burning aircraft. He ditched alongside a destroyer and was pulled from the water, one of the few pilots from his air group to survive the day. The statistics from June 19, 1944, tell a story almost beyond belief. The Japanese Navy lost approximately 380 aircraft. That day, the vast majority to Hellcats. American losses totaled 30 aircraft, with many of those due to anti-aircraft fire rather than air combat. The kill ratio was not merely favorable, it was catastrophic for Japan, representing the complete collapse of the qualitative advantage Japanese naval aviation had enjoyed early in the war. But numbers alone cannot convey the psychological impact on the surviving Japanese pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the weeks after the Marianas Turkey Shoot, as Japanese naval aviation attempted to rebuild and regroup, a profound change became evident in how pilots discussed combat with American forces. Pre-war confidence in the superiority of Japanese training and equipment had been replaced by something approaching fatalism. Reports from surviving pilots consistently described the Hellcat not merely as a superior aircraft, but as an unstoppable one. The psychological shift was fundamental. Japanese pilots were no longer fighting to achieve air superiority, but merely to survive long enough to complete their missions. The fear was not irrational. It was a rational response to the overwhelming evidence that the tactical situation had become hopeless. What made the Hellcat particularly terrifying from the Japanese perspective was how completely it had been optimized to exploit the Zero's unavoidable weaknesses. Japanese aircraft design philosophy had accepted certain trade-offs as necessary. Lightweight meant no armor, long range meant minimal ammunition, extreme maneuverability meant fragile construction. These trade-offs had been acceptable when Japanese pilots could control the terms of engagement, when their superior training and aircraft handling could force American pilots into positions where the Zero's advantages could be exploited. The Hellcat eliminated that option. Its performance envelope meant that American pilots could fight on their own terms, engaging when they held advantage and breaking off when they did not. The fuel tank vulnerability was particularly devastating psychologically. Zero pilots knew that a single lucky hit could transform their aircraft into a torch. American pilots called them flying Zippos because of how readily they burned. Hellcat pilots learned to aim for the area just forward of the cockpit, where the main fuel tank was located. Even a few rounds from a 50 caliber machine gun could rupture the tank, and without self-sealing capability, the aircraft would typically be engulfed in flames within seconds. Japanese pilots who had survived one or more aircraft fires carried that trauma with them into every subsequent combat. They knew that the Hellcat's armament could deliver this fate in a fraction of a second from angles and positions they had no hope of avoiding. The contrast with earlier American fighters made the psychological impact even more severe. F6F Wildcat pilots had been forced to work in teams, using defensive tactics that gave Japanese pilots opportunities to exploit their aircraft's superior maneuverability. The WWII, while effective at preventing Wildcats from being shot down, also presented moments when individual aircraft were vulnerable to a skilled Zero pilot willing to accept risk. These moments of vulnerability had given Japanese pilots hope, a sense that individual skill still mattered. The Hellcat removed even this small comfort. A Hellcat pilot with adequate training and good positional awareness was nearly untouchable to a Zero. He could control every aspect of the engagement, dictating when and how the fight would occur. By late 1944, Japanese tactical doctrine had evolved into a grim acceptance of these realities. Fighter pilots were increasingly assigned to escort duties rather than air superiority missions, tasked with protecting strike aircraft long enough for those aircraft to attack American carriers. This was explicitly a defensive role, an acknowledgement that Japanese fighters could no longer contest American air superiority. Even in this limited capacity, the losses were staggering. American Hellcat formations would typically ignore the bombers and torpedo planes initially, instead focusing on destroying the fighter escort. Once the Japanese fighters were eliminated or driven off, the strike aircraft slow and vulnerable were systematically shot down. Lieutenant Tanimizu flew his last combat mission in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He was part of a fighter escort assigned to protect a formation of dive bombers targeting American carriers off the Philippines. The Americans had over 200 Hellcats in the air that morning. His formation of 16 Zeros encountered the American fighter screen while still 40 miles from the carriers. The resulting engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. Tanimizu saw 11 of his squadron mates destroyed before he was shot down himself. His aircraft hit by a diving Hellcat he never saw until the 50 caliber rounds tore through his wing root and fuel tank. He was one of 3 pilots to survive the crash, pulled from the water by Filipino fishermen who turned him over to American forces. In post-war interviews, Tanimizu would describe his experiences with the Hellcat with a kind of resigned clarity. He acknowledged that Japanese training had been excellent, that the Zero had been a superb aircraft for its intended role, but that both had become obsolete in the face of American industrial and technological response. He noted that by late 1944, even the newest Japanese pilots, the ones with minimal training, rushed through abbreviated programs to replace staggering losses, knew that engaging Hellcats meant near certain death. They flew anyway, because duty demanded it, but the confidence and aggressive spirit that had characterized Japanese naval aviation early in the war had been systematically destroyed by the accumulated trauma of fighting an enemy they could not defeat. The final statistics of the Hellcat's combat record provide quantitative support for these qualitative assessments. F6F Hellcats were credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter type in any theater of the war. The Hellcat's kill ratio against Japanese aircraft was 19-1 for every Hellcat lost in air combat. 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. These are not the statistics of evenly matched opponents adapting and counter-adapting to each other's tactics. These are the numbers that result when one side achieves comprehensive technological and industrial superiority so complete that individual skill becomes largely irrelevant. But perhaps the most telling evidence of Japanese pilots' fear of the Hellcat comes from the evolution of Japanese tactical thinking in the final year of the war. By 1945, with experienced pilots nearly extinct and replacement training reduced to weeks rather than years, Japanese commanders largely abandoned conventional fighter tactics against American carrier formations. Instead, they embraced kamikaze attacks, suicide missions where the pilot became the weapon. This shift is often discussed in cultural terms as an expression of uniquely Japanese warrior philosophy. But from a tactical perspective, it also represented an admission that conventional fighter combat against Hellcats had become suicide anyway, with none of the compensating value of potentially damaging an enemy ship. The psychological journey from the confidence of early 1942, when Zero pilots believed themselves invincible, to the desperation of late 1945, when survival passed, one combat mission was considered fortunate, was mediated at every stage by encounters with Hellcats. The aircraft became synonymous with American air power, with the industrial might that could produce thousands of sophisticated fighters faster than Japan could train pilots to fight them. Japanese pilots feared the Hellcat not because it was cruel or because its pilots were particularly skilled, though many were, but because it represented an unbeatable system, one that rendered irrelevant everything they had trained for, everything they had believed about aerial combat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.